ready for a deep dive. This one's going to stay with you. We're going deep on the Bosnian War, but not the way you usually hear it. No, today's all about what if, right? The butterfly effect. What if one tiny thing was different at the start? Could have meant peace instead of poof. Well, you know.
It's true, the Bosnian War, 92 to 95, it's easy to see it as just this huge mess. And we can spend hours on every detail, but that's not the point today. We're using these sources to find those moments, those hinges where things could have gone the other way.
Well, don't need a PhD in history to follow along. I like that. But gotta set the stage a bit first, right?
Right. Picture this. Former Yugoslavia. Early 90s.
Yeah.
The whole place is like a pot about to boil over. Serbs, Bosniaks, Croats, all this tension just waiting to explode. But here's the thing, it wasn't inevitable. This wasn't some, pre-programmed tragedy.
Okay, so that's where the butterfly comes in.
Yeah.
Like if we could rewind to those early days, find those little things that if they went differently. Our source does this really well, actually, by focusing on one date. April 6th, 1992, you're in Sarajevo, the capital, and boom, siege. Bosnian Serb forces, they surround the city.
Imagine that, just going about your life, and suddenly your city's a war zone. The fear, the uncertainty, it's hard to even comprehend.
Chilling, yeah. And this is our first what if. What if that siege never happened? How different would everything be today if that one thing somehow had been stopped?
Makes you think, right? And it leads us to those in charge, those with the power to change things. Take Slobodan Milosevic, Serbia's president at the time. Our source doesn't hold back, calls him a major player in the bloodshed, someone who actively made things worse.
He was all about Serbian nationalism, wasn't he?
Absolutely. And here's where the butterfly effect gets really interesting. Milosevic's backing of those nationalist movements within Bosnia, the military aid he sent to the Bosnian Serbs, it's like throwing gasoline on a fire that's already raging.
So he chose division, not unity.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
But get this. Our source says, what if he'd done the opposite? What if he'd used his position to bring people together? Talked about shared history, common ground, that kind of thing.
Now, that's something I hadn't considered. How would that have changed everything?
Exactly. And speaking of change, there's a story our source tells. It really does. You start to see how even one person's choices can have this, domino effect. But, gotta remember, Milosevic wasn't acting alone. The rest of the world, they knew what was up, right?
Right. It's not like it was a secret. You'd think someone would have stepped in, put a stop to it.
You'd hope so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Sadly, reality's more complicated. Our source actually calls out the UN and the European community, says they really dropped the ball on this one.
What went wrong then? Why couldn't they stop the violence?
Not a simple answer, but our source points to a few things. One, they were just slow. By the time they realized how bad it was, things were already spiraling.
So too little, too late.
Pretty much. And even when they did get involved, it was wishy-washy, no real force behind it. The source talks about the UN peacekeepers, how they were totally outmatched, not enough people, not enough equipment.
Like they didn't get how bad it could get.
Yeah. And that brings up another huge what if. What if they'd gone in strong right from the start? A united front saying, this ends now. Could that have changed things?
Man, that's a heavy question. Makes you wonder, what would you have done knowing what we know now? Could it have been stopped?
Tough to say.
Yeah.
But on that note, we can't talk about the Bosnian War without talking about Srebrenica.
Srebrenica, God, that name. July 95, it's just awful.
A real low point. Over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys murdered, just wiped out. Ethnic cleansing turning into genocide.
Our source uses this phrase, catastrophic humanitarian consequences, like beyond tragic. So many lives lost, families destroyed.
It is, and it brings up that lingering what if. Srebrenica, the UN declared it a safe zone, but what if they'd actually protected it? What if they'd sent enough force to make it mean something?
A safe zone. Should have been a haven, right? Instead, it became that.
The worst kind of irony. And it makes you think, if they'd acted differently, could it have been prevented? Tough questions with no easy answers.
No kidding. But eventually the war did end. The fighting stopped, right?
It did. The Dayton Accords, signed in 95, finally brought a ceasefire. But as our source points out, peace.
Yeah?
It came with a price. Bittersweet,
Bittersweet how? What was the catch?
Well, yeah, the Dayton Accords, they stopped the fighting, sure. But they also created this whole system in Bosnia. Politically complicated, to say the least. And our source, to make a good point, it didn't really fix anything. If anything, it made those ethnic divisions, the ones that caused the war, even worse.
So instead of rebuilding, bringing people together, It kept them apart.
Exactly. It became all about who had what power, which, as our source says, just made things more divided in the long run.
Yeah.
Like trying to create peace, but accidentally making it easier to fight again later.
Wow. Makes you think, after a war, what if they'd focused on healing instead? Like building a shared identity, not just splitting up the power.
Big what if, right? Imagine if they'd said, okay, let's rebuild trust, let's reconcile, give people a chance to come together, rebuild their lives, their country.
Yeah, you can't help but wonder what might have been. But, flaws and all, the Dayton Accords did end the fighting. So where does Bosnia go from there? What happens next?
That's the question, isn't it? Because that war, it still casts a huge shadow, even today. The scars are there. Some you can see, some you can't.
So even though it's over, those what ifs, they still matter.
They do. And that's what makes this whole thing so important to talk about. The Bosnian War, as horrible as it was, it reminds us that history isn't the end of the story. Those what ifs, they make us think, look at the choices that were made and ask, could we have done better?
It's like we have that power, even in small ways, to make different choices.
Absolutely. And those choices, as we've seen, they echo through time.
Man, it's a lot, but it really makes you think. So if someone's listening, what's the one thing you want them to take away from all this? About the Bosnian War, about these what ifs, what's the big lesson?
I'd say this. The past is set, but the future, that's still being written. Every day, we all make choices, big and small, and those choices, they have power. So let's learn from what happened in Bosnia. Let's choose unity, choose understanding, choose to build peace actively every chance we get.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We can all make a difference. That's the thing to remember. Well, thanks to everyone for joining us for this deep dive. It's been intense, but important. And until next time, keep asking those what ifs and keep working towards a better, more peaceful world. We can do it.